What's happening? Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to, I think this is, I don't know, what number is this? Are we on number 13, I think? I'm not really counting. I'm just going skill by skill. We have 20, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 left. This must be number 13. Welcome to the 13th skill on the 20 trainable behavior skills that unleash greatness, part of the essential 2020 guide to self-awareness, self-confidence, and self-control. If this is the first time you're joining live, welcome. I'm glad you're here. I hope that you enjoy this one. I know you will. And take the opportunity to go back and watch any of the previous ones and keep coming back and joining in. If you're here and you're on the live version, make sure you check in on the chat. Let me and my team and everybody else know where you're viewing from. It's always nice to see who's in the house, who's in the chats, and it helps me get to know you. I see a lot of familiar names, a lot of familiar faces here, and so it's great to see. We got Dave coming in from Phoenix. We got Eric, David, Charlie, Chris, Jeremy out in Hoquiam, Washington. Am I saying that right? So let's begin here. I like this particular skill because this is not something, risk management. This is not something I am particularly good at. I'm wired to be. I'm risk willing. I am aggressive. Tobruk, I know you see the shirt, right? This shirt is fire. This is Tobruk Blaine's Agogi, if you can see it. Ready? Like, this is the Agogi Academy shirt out of the San Jose State football program. She's got this amazing preparation for life training that is done through the Agogi Academy that she created out there for football players and I think for a lot of other athletes as well. She does an amazing job with it. So she was kind enough to give me one of these shirts, and it's one of my favorite ones. So I'm wearing it today. Might be a little warm for it today, but it's cool in here. So risk management. This one is particular to me. This one's near and dear to my heart, and it's near and dear to my life because I am not naturally a good risk manager. And what I mean by that is my version of that is I am wired to take risks. I am wired to be risk willing. I am wired to ignore the odds, ignore the stats, ignore the consequences, and go. I've been like that since I was a tiny little kid, and I am like that now as a grown adult and a dad myself. And so me getting better at risk management is about being more thorough with how I view scenarios, how I view life. And for me, it is about, for me, it's not, and again, I share this so that you can just kind of see the angle at which this can be approached. For me, risk management is about not taking unnecessary risk that doesn't have a payoff worth the potential consequences. That's always been where I need to manage this. And for other people, it might be the inverse, right? It might be they need to be taking more risks that they might perceive as too big, but taking risks and being willing to take those risks where the potential payoff is much larger than whatever the downside would be. And so with risk management, again, communicating the simple skill of this. Risk management is the simple skill of only risking what you're willing to accept losing, never taking risks that could destroy you, and always paying the price for your own risks. You think about those three things. It is never risk what you're not willing to lose, which is interesting because sometimes we'll risk things we don't want to lose, and they're things that we've never had, and we still don't risk them. So I'll come back to that one. This is a very specific definition. It's a very specific layout. Never risk what you're not willing to lose. Don't take risks that could destroy you, and pay a price for your own risks. And those three things are incredibly important because if you just take those three, look how simple they are. And if we just stopped, right? If I said, all right, scene, that's it, we're done. Right? And you went out and you just applied those three. And you said, all right, I'm never going to risk something that I'm not willing to lose. If you actually did that, you would have to drive differently than you probably drive today for most of you. You'd have to drive because you take risks in the car in the way that you drive, and the things that you would be losing if you were to make a mistake, or you would have put yourself in a position where somebody else made a mistake that cost you because you were being more aggressive or tailgating or swerving or speeding or whatever it would be. It would cost you something that you would not be willing to accept if it actually happened. And so if you just did it, people say, well, how do I calculate? This isn't about calculating. This is about the simple skill. Don't risk what you're not willing to lose. Because if you do risk it and then you lose it, those cries and tears are going to fall on deaf ears, right? The oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. I bet $20 in blackjack and then I lost it, and I'm so mad I lost my money. Well, you put down $20 and you risked it. That's how it works. We do this in life all the time, and you find that people are risking things, and then it doesn't go their way, or they lose it, and they're upset that it didn't, work out that way because they were never willing to lose it, and they didn't recognize that. Number two is don't take any risk that could destroy you, right? And so that's where the way a lot of people drive is again, from a risk management perspective, it is something so far beyond the boundary of anything even remotely close to a smart or good or useful or rational decision. It borders on lunacy when we actually put up the truth. We're going to increase our chances of having a disastrous car accident because we convince ourselves we're a really good driver or nothing will happen. And the reason we're going to do that is to save 30 to 60, maybe 90 seconds on a drive. Or if it's a long drive on a freeway, we're going to save 4 minutes. And we're going to put ourselves at an exposure where the risk of an accident would be devastating. And it is a mismanagement of risk. It is not understanding that you could, for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, you could drive that way with a high-risk exposure. You could have a perfect and flawless record. You could never have made a mistake. Because in that scenario, that risk and the actual accident, how many times does it need to happen to cost you everything? Out of 20 years, how many times would you need to get into an accident like that, where that risk, even if you were 1,000 for 1,000, in terms of your consistency of driving and your ability to avoid accidents, and if you driven 1,000, 10,000 days and it never cost you a thing, and then one day you make that mistake because of the way you drive. And so what that is a great example of, it's a risk that does not have a real and tangible and valuable payoff, very low upside. You're saving 30 seconds here, maybe you get home a little bit quicker, and even that is not really an upside because you're stressed and mad and angry and pissed off the whole way. And so it's actually costing you a lot to gain this really irrelevant payoff. But the potential downside consequence of the risk is massive, and you get no credit for your past successes because you only need to have a problem happen once to have it potentially cost you everything. That's risk management. And then the last piece is always paying the price for your own risks. And the reason this one is important, and again, if you calculate this out, I'm sorry, not calculate. If you don't calculate, you just implement. You just act on these three things. All right, I'm number one is I'm only going to risk what I'm willing to accept losing. Well, then you actually start to see, all right, this is something that I'd be okay if I took a risk to gain a lot. If I lost that, because I could recover. This right here could cost me everything and devastate me, so I'm not going to take any of those risks. And then the third piece is making sure that any risks you take, that you're the one paying the price for it. What we need to do in life and make sure that we don't ever fall into the trap of is taking risk on somebody else's behalf, right? Is not making decisions where other people pay the negative consequences for our mistakes, because that takes us out of the arena. That disconnects us from our willingness to engage in a behavior that may or may not have risk associated with it, but we get insulated from consequences if somebody else pays the price. We need those consequences to be near us, right? Those need to be consequences we feel, good, bad, or indifferent, because that's the best learning material that we have. And so part is, don't expose other people to risk because of what you've done. And the second part of it is make sure that you're always feeling the consequences of risks you're taking or not taking, so that you're actually getting feedback on what's working and not working, and you can make adjustments going forward. So, risk is inherent, right? Risk is built into life. Everything is risky. Driving is risky. Starting a relationship is risky. Getting married is risky. Becoming an employee in a business is risky, as people are sort of rudely awakening to the reality that being an employee in a company is not a safe avenue, at least not safe like they thought. It is not protected like they thought. And a lot of people are learning in this environment that what they thought was safe and what they thought was really low risk actually carried with it a significant amount of risk. And, excuse me. So driving in a car is risky. Investing your money is risky. Being physically active is risky. Getting on an airplane is risky. All of this stuff is risky. The point is, life is built, or risk is built into life. And the first real self-awareness that we need to have is that we have to get good at risk management, because there is no painless path in life. There is no risk-free option. There is no safe route. Not how we think about it. There is no safe route. So every route you pick is going to have risk elements in them. Some of them very clear, some of them subtle, some of them hidden, some of them immediate, some of them long-term. Everything has risk. So building into ourselves a good system and filter and decision-making process for how to see and make decisions and act with risk management in mind is massively important. Here's what we want to do. We want to recognize that people who risk nothing get nothing, and they deserve it. People who risk everything usually end up in ruin, and they deserve it as well. This is not about zero risk, and this is not about all risk. This is about disciplined, strategic, smart risk in real life. And we'll go through some examples of what I'm talking about. Okay. The core that I would like you to understand about risk is it's not a new idea. And I have a sneeze coming on. Hold on. Excuse me. Sneezing, got a little cough here. It's almost like it's springtime coming through. The key to risk management in our lives is ensuring that what we're doing is driving and maximizing the upside while minimizing and lowering the downside as much as possible. And that requires a different way of viewing things than maybe we typically do, okay? So from a self-awareness perspective, I've got 4 questions that I have, and I'll show you what these 4 are, and they're in the Know Yourself, the self-awareness section, okay, of the 2020 guide, right? They're right here, and there's 4 questions, and you can see them, okay? And here's what these 4 questions ask. This is the self-awareness we can bring to risk management, right? And I'll say these, and you can go back and watch this when it's over to get back through them, or we can ask questions about it later. Number 1, by the way, thank you for the bless here. Okay, self-awareness, 4 questions to get into the practice and habit of asking. Number 1, what's bigger, the best case scenario upside or the worst case scenario downside? And what that is saying is, okay, when I'm driving, if I were to speed and try to hurry home and drive 85 to 90, right, on the freeway rather than 70, what's the best case scenario upside of that? The best case scenario upside is you save how much time? Maybe 5 minutes, right? Maybe. And part of this is also calculating what you actually gain. Like, do you know how much time you gain or lose when you drive 85 or 90 on the freeway, or if you're swerving in and out, or if you're speeding, whatever those things are? Most of the time, if it's a 30-minute drive, you're saving 30 to 45 seconds. So your maximum upside is a very tiny fraction of time savings. And here's the second part of that. with the time you save on that drive, what are you going to do with that time? And this is what I ask. I ask myself, if I'm driving, if I feel like, oh, I really want to go, okay, what would I do with the time saved by speeding and hustling and, driving erratically like that? Even if I feel like I'm in control, what would I do with that extra time? When I got home, what would I do those extra 90 seconds? And there's nothing valuable I'm doing with those extra 90 seconds when I get home. So the upside is very minimal. Secondarily, what's the downside? The downside is I could get a ticket, I could get in a wreck, I could I could get in a wreck and cause physical harm or damage to somebody else. I could potentially do it to myself. I could potentially do it to a passenger, right? So for me, it's this. For me, is the upside of saving 90 seconds worth exposing myself to the potential downside of getting in an accident, even if it wasn't likely, getting in an accident, hurting myself or somebody else, or getting a ticket? And the answer is no, right? So the first question is, what's bigger, the upside or the downside? And when you start asking that question, upside, downside, we start getting much more clear answers. So for example, if I said, hey, go do a presentation, okay, to an audience of people that could really facilitate something that was really important to you, right? Go do a presentation, and it would be to a bunch of your peers, and it would whatever. Public speaking is a big fear, and so get on stage and you're going to do a presentation, and if you do a good presentation, you maybe you get a promotion, or you get credibility that really advances your career or your business or whatever it is. The downside of doing that presentation is people see it and they don't like your presentation. Okay. I had a little arrow that a streaming issue. So if this stream is still going for you guys, shoot something in the comments, because I have an error saying there's streaming issues here. So just let me know if you guys are still getting this, because I want to make sure that this is still working. Okay. So the first is, what is the upside compared to what is the downside? And I like to consider what's the best upside and what's the worst downside, and look at those two things and see which one is actually bigger and more intense. Okay. The second piece, okay, again, on these 4 questions is, thank you guys, that we're good. The second question is, how bad would the worst case downside be, and would you be willing to deal with it? Would it work? How bad would the downside be, and would you be okay with it? All right, and so that's where a lot of times you'll see people who get into a car accident, and after the car accident is over, they'll look back at themselves and be like, I'm such an idiot. Because in retrospect, it wasn't worth it. In retrospect, if they had stopped to consider what might happen, they would have seen that, of course, it wouldn't be worth it if this was what we're going to deal with. And when we think about risk, we typically don't think about the realities of the upsides and the downsides. Okay. So again, what's bigger, the best case upside or the worst case downside? Second, how bad would the worst case downside be, and could you live with it? Number 3, what would you do if the downside happened? Okay, get practical. What would you do if the downside happened? When you're thinking about risk, you've got to ask yourself what you would do if the worst happened, so that you know whether or not you're willing to expose yourself to that. And then number 4 is, if the worst happened, what would you do? Number 4 is, how could you recover from the worst case scenario, and how quickly? Okay. So I'll give you a very accessible one. I've talked about this before. A lot of you have heard this example. It's like risk management with asking somebody on a date. Fear of failure is being afraid of what you don't have and you're already failing. So asking somebody on a date is this: what's the best upside scenario and what's the worst downside scenario? Well, the best case upside scenario is you meet somebody incredible and you fall in love and you get married, right? Like that's the big upside, okay? The more realistic or probable upside is you meet somebody, you get to know somebody, you get a date, you go on some dates, and you actually meet a really great, cool person who you end up getting close to. Like, that's a really good upside, right? The downside is that somebody you already didn't know tells you they want to continue to not know you. And some strangers, maybe a friend of yours with you, sees you get shot down at the bar or the coffee shop or whatever. So when the point is, like, this isn't really a failure. This isn't really a risk, the downside, because you already didn't know them. You already weren't dating them. You already didn't have a relationship with them. And then if they shut you down, you still don't. So there's no real downside. And so you can recover from that really easily, even if it stings the ego. It's like, oh, that's a bummer. The recovery from that is fine because you wake up the next day or whatever, you go to lunch or, you go to bed and you wake up and you're like, well, I still don't know who that person is. I haven't lost a thing. So it's learning how to be smarter with managing risk by calculating. Again, I don't want to use the word calculating, by applying very simple standards, rules, systems, heuristics, whatever it is that you want to call these things, okay? So these 4 questions: what's bigger, upside or downside? Number 2, how bad would the worst case downside scenario actually be, and could you live with it? Number 3, what would you do if that scenario happened? Number 4, could you recover from it, and if so, how quickly? Those are 4 really great questions to ask. The more disciplined you are, you'll ask those questions quickly. Second piece on control yourself. I love this one because this one is eminently practical. When it comes to taking risks, this does not require a ton of description. Take a lot of minor risks. Make a lot of minor mistakes. The more, the better. Take a lot of minor risks. Make a lot of minor mistakes. When you take a ton of risks that are minor and you make a lot of mistakes that are minor, you learn faster. You get a lot more reps, you try a lot more things, and you give yourself more potential upside to capture over time. Then, right, avoid the major risks and avoid the major mistakes, right? When it comes to making mistakes, rather than try to not make any mistakes, I mean, this is just a great mental and emotional thing to put into your life. Rather than trying to not make mistakes, just decide on the mistakes that you're not going to make, the kind of mistakes. Make a ton of mistakes. Just make smart ones, make good ones, make ones that don't cost you very much. And then identify the mistakes that could cost you everything or cost you way more than you'd be willing to deal with, and decide permanently not to make those mistakes. And I'll give you a very simple one. Here's one that almost everybody makes. And they've never made a decision on this. It's change, refusing to change. Why people don't change, I don't understand. Here's a second one. Accepting feedback or listening to feedback without getting defensive. Right? There is zero upside to getting defensive with somebody who gives you feedback. None. There is no upside. It's all downside. Okay? And yet, people do it all the time. Resisting change over and over and over and over and over again has been borne out to be one of the most devastating things to people and businesses and families, is people who simply refuse to adjust and shift their behavior or their work patterns or their processes, whatever it is. People who refuse to change, they eventually get broken or they get beaten in a competitive environment, or everything passes them by. And so you can look and say, all right, that's a mistake that I've seen enough of in other people, and maybe even in yourself, that I don't want to make that mistake because it's way too big. So make the small mistakes, avoid the big ones, and then obviously you learn from all of them. This is what controlling yourself is, okay? So here's how I like to think of this. This is actually really helpful, and if you got a pen, write this piece down, okay? Write this one down. If you take a lot of minor risks, make a lot of minor mistakes, and if you avoid major risks and you evade the major mistakes, that's the path of genius. The opposite is the path of regret. You avoid the minor mistakes and you end up making the major ones. And unfortunately, it's all too common. And then the last piece is believe in yourself, okay? The self-confidence elements of this. When you take a risk that has a much higher chance of payoff than it does of losing, right? So asking somebody on a date, excuse me, when you actually look at asking somebody on a date, you say, hey, the payoff to this is I could meet somebody really incredible and bring a lot of joy into my life and add a new relationship, friend, or whatever. And the downside is I just still don't know who that person is. What happens is when you can see that, then you realize your upside is potential is massive opportunity and your downside is almost none. What happens is fear dissipates, confidence rises, right? And you accelerate forward. Obstacles feel like minor little speed bumps. And I think this is one of the cool parts about this, right? If you wanted to start a podcast and you don't have one and you're afraid nobody will listen, you recognize that if you don't have a podcast, people are already not listening to your podcast. If you wanted to do YouTube lives like this and you're afraid nobody would watch, recognize that people are already not watching you on YouTube live, right? There's no risk to take if you're not doing it and then you decide, well, I don't want to do it because what if this doesn't happen? Because it's already not happening. But if you do it, the potential upside is huge. And once you see that and you say, well, I could not do it and continue not having anybody watch, or I could do it and have 10 people watch, or 2 people, or 200,000, and I could do 100 in a row, and I could grow a really big audience and really put a lot of good stuff in the world and facilitate a lot of my dreams. When people talk about fear of failure, this is the mismanagement of risk in their minds. It's just a complete miscalculation. People do not, like I show this up right here, right? Here's this scale, right? And if this is the top end and that's the bottom end, and when you talk about moving up here and trying to get across that, or trying to get elite up here, and I ask, why do people not go up there? And everybody says, well, fear of failure. And my whole point is to let people know, look, if you're not at the top already, you can't say that you're not trying to get up there because you're afraid of not being able to get up there, because you're already not there. Whatever it is that you want to be great at, if you don't try because you're afraid of what might happen if you tried, recognize that you're afraid of something that you already don't possess. Giving yourself a chance, that's right. Not trying, that's the biggest risk, because that has the downside that is the most massive, which is you don't get what you want and you get caught, right? You get stuck, and then you have to live with the understanding that you never actually tried. That's the biggest risk. And the last piece on self-confidence, the last piece on self-confidence is that when you avoid risk, right? When you avoid risk that has a significantly, how do we phrase this? When you avoid risk that has a cost of failure, right? That is significantly higher than whatever the payoff of success is, right? You remove most of the pitfalls that can undermine you and destroy you. Let me say that again one time. When you avoid risk where the cost of failure is significantly higher than whatever the payoff would be, you take out the pitfalls. Like, for example, it's a pretty straightforward example, right? A DUI, for example, and you think about what obviously it's a potential devastating scenario, but if we take it kind of a little bit lighter, right? It's you obviously you get in legal trouble, you get in cost trouble, you lose your license for a while, and when you look at it, obviously it can cost a ton. And when you actually look at it, in that one, the cost of failure, the cost of the downside to driving after you've had a few drinks is so significantly higher than the upside of driving after you've had a few drinks. Because you could take an Uber or get a ride or do whatever, and your upside would be identical to you driving home. But to drive home, what you add in is you add in the unnecessary exposure to a potential major devastating pitfall. And this is the calculation that we want to do, right? And Chewburger, yes, you can absolutely ask a question. Great name, Chewburger. So here's how we do this. Self-confidence is identifying where is my upside potential significantly higher than the downside potential, cost. And in those environments, you have a ton of confidence, right? You have a ton of the fear dissipates away and you're moving. And then you can identify when the potential downside and the cost of it is so much higher than whatever the benefit it would deliver to you is. And you can smartly avoid taking a risk. Maybe other people do it, but you're going to avoid making a risk because what you know is this. If you take risks where the downside is significantly higher than the upside, eventually it's going to hit. It's like a roulette wheel. Eventually it's gonna land on the one that costs you a lot. So not even exposing yourself to those is the primary objective. Getting this calculation right in our head is the number one thing that we want to do. And again, I kept using that word calculation, and I should get you a better language because I don't want you thinking calculating. I don't want you thinking odds per se and all those different things. Just smart decisions. Upside, downside, which one's bigger, be smart. I really do think, and we'll jump into some questions, fire away, go ahead. I really do think that the simplest version of this is recognizing that the three things we said in the beginning. Only take risks where you're willing to lose whatever it is that you're putting out there, and never expose yourself to risks that could destroy you and ruin you, and always pay the price for your own risks. If you can operate by those three things, and then you can add in a couple others later, but those are the core. Then you can add in, okay, how do I smartly go after things that have a lot of really good potential, where even if I wasn't successful in it, it's not going to cost me more than I was willing to bear. Now, it might cost you and it might sting, but the point is going back to these self-awareness questions of I could recover, and I could recover within a reasonable period of time, but the upside it could give me would be massive. And it's like doing a speech. I don't get nervous when I speak because even if I were to speak and that audience hated me and I bombed, how does my life get affected by that? Like legitimately. If I go do a presentation in a big keynote and like the audience just can't stand it and I just get terrible ratings, it's not like my business dies. It's not like my business is over. Maybe that client doesn't hire me again. Maybe the people in that room leave with a bad taste in their mouth about me and they think that I'm not very good. And that might sting, but it doesn't really cost me anything significant because one, my own identity is not tied to that audience's perception of me, just like it's not tied to a good perception of me. And the ability to recover from that is no problem. So it's just a good way to think about that. So anyway, let's jump in here. Let's see if there's any questions. Yeah. John Duffy, chill out, man. Chill out, brother. No need for that in here. We're all good. Chewburger, thoughts on taking risks in the stock market in the current climate? Yes, very simple standards, and I'm not offering stock advice. I never do, right? And nor am I an expert in any of these things. But I think this is a great example where don't risk what you're not willing to lose, okay? And don't risk anything that if you lost it, because it is volatile and unpredictable, would cost you a ton, or would cost you something that would, put you in a hole that you couldn't or would take you way too long to recover from. So, from a stock market perspective, right, you're looking for areas where you can take a risk, where if you're right, the upside of it is high, and if you're wrong, the downside of it is low or whatever it is that you put in. And so you'd be looking for scenarios where, could you do something in the stock market where you put in, $100, and if things go well and the opportunity, the upside captures, you could make 1,000. But if you were wrong, you would lose 100. That's what we're looking for, right? What we don't want is you want to make bets where you got to put in 1,000, right? And you win 1,000, lose 1,000 based on odds that aren't really great, or you don't want to put in something where you put a large amount of money in and you're playing with that and you play it all the way down with money that you can't afford to lose, where you're making really, really small numbers on a large exposure that if something were to devastatingly happen in the market would really pull everything down. And again, you see a lot of people doing this, but this is not stock market exact scenarios. This is just risk management, really the core basics of it. Look for opportunity upsides that have pretty fixed and limited downsides. And obviously in the stock market, there's a lot of places where you can go with that, a lot of ways to do it. But that's how I would look at it. That's how I do. Barth, teens don't usually think to ask the questions about risk. How do you teach younger crowds to think about the risk before entering into risky behavior? Well, number one, Barth, is if we're going to be talking with teens or younger people, I'm always going to build it into E plus R equals O. So I'm going to go foundationally to make sure that they're applying E plus R equals O and they understand how that tool works before we get into anything even close to risk management. Number two is teens are never going to be good at risk management. That's not how the teenage years work. They're just not built like that. And if they are, it's not because if they are built like that, it's not because of necessarily anything that we did. It's because they were wired like that. So that's what we do that. Number three is I would literally teach them exactly what we're talking about here. Look at their upside and the downside, right? And just start learning how to calculate it and ask these 4 questions to yourself. Talk about them, put real scenarios up, use successes, average things, and failures to teach, and make sure that they're always seeing the direct line of sight on the consequences, and then go back and give them permission to make a lot of mistakes and make a lot of errors and take a lot of minor risks and help them avoid the major ones and the major errors. And then last is play the long game with the teenagers. The likeliest scenario is that they'll get it later. And so your job is to install. I really think the teen years are the years where you install and you put structure in, equip with skills, and the payoff comes later. I just don't expect the majority of the payoff to happen during the teen years. And I'm actually okay with teenagers. I'm actually okay if I don't see the payoff during the teen years, because I just know what it's like to be a teenager, and I'm going to be real about what that is. It happens later. They're just not built and wired for it. All right. Couple more questions here. Charlie, there are situations where you're in a position where decisions you make inevitably affect the lives of others. Thinking as a leader of major businesses, how do you balance the risk there? Yes. In those scenarios where the decisions that you make inevitably affect the lives of others, what you have to make sure is that your risk exposure is equal to or greater than theirs, right? When that, I run a business, right? And so I make decisions, and those decisions are right or wrong. And there are people who work on the team with me, and the decisions that I make affect them. So what I can't do is I can't make decisions where they are exposed to risk that I'm not exposed to. I can't make decisions where they would pay a price for my choices that I don't also pay. But the nature of leading people and the nature of being in an environment where you're up in front of that is that you are going to make decisions that other people will be affected by. So I love the question, Charlie, because you're taking seriously the role of leadership, and you're seeing that there is risk in everything, and that there is no painless path. Obviously, one of the key areas for this, one of the big areas where this gets applied is obviously in military, right? And when people wars and people who are leading combat units, they're making decisions with life and death on the line. I'm not doing that. I don't know everybody who's in here right now, but you're probably not doing that. And those are tough, right? Those are hard. And what you'll find is that the people who get respected and the people who they say in those particular environments, who are the best leaders and who are the best decision makers, they're either guys that have been in those environments before, right? They've been on those front lines. They've seen bullets flying around. They've seen that, and they've touched it, and so they know what they're asking people to do. And the second is you see people who are making those decisions, and they are out there on the front lines with those people. So that's the key question, is if you got to make decisions that inevitably affect the lives of other people, make sure that you are right there paying that price with them, preferably first, and preferably your risk exposure is at least as much, if not more so than theirs, so that you are paying an equal price. And if somebody else is going through pain, so are you if it was your decision. And that's the cause and effect that you need to stay very close and very tight to. So, yeah, David, the idea of teen years being install is big. That's just what they are. I go back. I mean, I know you, me, like I was not my best as a teen. You know, I'm significantly better now than I was as a teen. And I think if I were to go back to my teenage years I turned 38 this week. If I were to go back from my 38-year-old self and go back and interact with my 17-year-old, 16, 15-year-old self, I think this 38-year-old self would be embarrassed at a lot of stuff that my 15-year-old self did, thought, acted, portrayed themselves, experienced that I delivered. I think I would be. I was a good kid, and there's all kinds of other stuff I would have enjoyed, but I also would have looked and been like, dang, like you had some gaps, brother. Like that's what I would have done. So I would expect, and I always appreciated myself when I was a kid, of somebody who left me room to grow and understood where I was. And I still appreciate that. I still like that. So anyway, this has been fantastic. Thanks for joining on a Sunday. We went about another 40 minutes here today. And what we're going to jump into tomorrow on Monday, and we'll be back tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll do a morning session on Monday, and we are going to be on skill 14, which is the simple skill of honesty. Yes, honesty. How do we be skillful about being honest and telling the truth? Because it is much, much harder than most people portray it to be. So I appreciate it. I hope this was useful for you, valuable to you, and that you've got areas in your life where you can go out and you can apply this. Please, as always, if you enjoyed this, hit the like button, recommend somebody come, invite somebody tomorrow. I love every one of you who comes in and joins these live, and those of you who watch these on replay. The fact you'd be here and dialed in for these 41 and change minutes, it means a ton to me. And even if there was just one of you in here, I'd be in here doing it and delivering it just the same. So I appreciate you all. Thank you, and have a great rest of your weekend.